Moscow, May 8, 2025. The plane carrying the Chinese leader lands on Russian soil. Xi Jinping gets off the plane and heads to the Grand Kremlin Palace, where he will meet Putin. So far, nothing wrong, right? After all, they are close allies. Both have already declared that their partnership has no limits. Putin. He has already called Xi his dear friend. Xi reciprocated, calling Putin an old comrade. For the whole world, this is one of the greatest alliances of today. But what if I told you that behind these public displays of friendship, there's a completely different reality? And what if all of this is just a facade? In this video, I'm going to show you a different perspective on what's happening. And you'll understand what's really behind this alliance between China and Russia. To understand what's really happening between China and Russia, there's a detail that many people have overlooked. I'm talking about an event that happened on February 27, 2022. Pay close attention to this date because it's a key piece in this puzzle. On this day, exactly 3 days after Putin invaded Ukraine, something extraordinary happened in the corridors of power in Moscow. The Federal Security Service, which is Russia's main security agency, created an ultra-secret counterintelligence program. The codename of this program was INTENTE-4. This word can be associated with understanding, pact, or alliance. As you can see, the choice of this name was not random. It was an ironic reference to the growing friendship between Russia and China. But behind that name, there was a very serious concern. Why exactly 3 days after the invasion? Well, the answer is going to shock you. In these 3 days, Russia realized it had made a gigantic strategic mistake. I'm referring to more than just the Ukraine war. I'm talking about something much bigger. Look, when Putin decided to invade Ukraine, he had to reallocate practically all his espionage and intelligence resources to the Ukrainian front. And just so you have an idea, in 2023 alone, Ukraine discovered 47 Russian spy networks operating in its territory. This means that almost all Russian spies were focused on Ukraine, leaving Russia itself vulnerable 4,000 kilometers away from Moscow. And what about China? Well, they realized this golden opportunity. In June 2024, ultra-secret Federal Security Service documents were leaked to the international press by a group called Eris Leaks. What these documents reveal is simply intriguing. They show that behind all that staged friendship we see in the media, there is a completely different reality. In the internal documents, the Russian intelligence services themselves refer to China not as a partner, but as an enemy and a serious threat to Russian security. 6 Western intelligence agencies analyzed these documents and confirmed their authenticity. The New York Times was able to verify their accuracy through multiple independent sources. We're not talking about conspiracy theories here, we're talking about official Russian government documents. I know at this point you might be scratching your head and thinking, but how is that possible? If they're such good friends, why would the Federal Security Service create a special program specifically to protect itself from China? The answer lies in that key day I mentioned earlier, in what China did right after Putin invaded Ukraine. Pay attention to this pattern. Immediately after the war began, a flood of officials from Chinese defense companies and institutes linked to Chinese intelligence started arriving in Russia. They weren't tourists. They weren't regular investors. They were spies, disguised as businessmen. Their goal was very specific. According to Federal Security Service documents, China was interested in information about combat methods using drones, modernization of military software, and, above all, methods to counter new types of Western weapons. In other words, China was using the war in Ukraine as a giant laboratory to study NATO military technology. Think about the brilliance of this strategy. While Russia was wearing itself out fighting against Western weaponry in Ukraine, China was gathering second-hand information about those same weapons without having to enter into direct conflict. It was like having access to American and European military secrets through the back door. And it doesn't stop there. China was particularly interested in information about aviation, an area where they had always lagged behind Russia. The documents show that China was hiring former employees of Russian aircraft factories, as well as employees who were still working there, but were dissatisfied with the cuts the Russian government made to military programs. Now, if you're interested in military affairs, you probably already know that China has an undeniable history of copying Western military technology. Do you want an example? In 2015, the United States Naval Institute reported that a large part of China's military modernization happened by copying American weapons systems. The legendary F-35 fighter jet and the unmanned combat vehicles X-47B have Chinese equivalents that are almost identical. Now they're doing the same thing with Russian technology and indirectly with NATO weapons that are being used in Ukraine. But here's what makes this even more interesting. RAND, a United States organization that mainly conducts research in the political field, released a report in February 2025 suggesting that China is not as militarily prepared as it appears. That's because the People's Liberation Army spends 40% of its training time on political matters, not on actual military preparation. This means, in other words, that China knows it needs to compensate for this weakness by imitating, not to say something else, technology from other countries. Now, let's move on to the second front of this Chinese operation, which might be even more audacious. China and Russia share a border of 4,207 kilometers. And here's something that few people know. Chinese nationalists have long expressed dissatisfaction with a 19th century treaty that resulted in Russia annexing portions of China that today make up the city of Vladivostok. But hold on, things get even worse. In August 2023, China published an official national map that used Chinese names instead of Russian names for several locations in the Russian Far East. And if that wasn't a direct message to Putin, I don't know what is. As you can see, China is signaling that it might be interested in reclaiming those lost territories from back then. It's a pattern we see in other regions, like in the case of Taiwan. Now, going back to the Federal Security Service documents, they also point out that Chinese scholars are now looking for evidence of ancient Chinese people in the Russian Far East, with the intention of using any discoveries to influence local opinion in those regions. It's exactly the same tactic that Putin used in Ukraine, claiming historical reasons to justify territorial invasion.
I've said many times that I consider the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be really one people. In that sense, all of Ukraine is ours.
Without a doubt. The irony here is brutal. Putin is falling victim to the very strategy he uses against other countries. Just as he claims that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, China can now very well start claiming that certain Russian regions are historically Chinese. To give you an idea of how China thinks strategically, look at how they justify their claims in the South China Sea. They base their claims on the Qin dynasty, which ruled between 221 and 206 AD. They use their millennia-old history to justify modern territorial expansion. But perhaps China's smartest move is on the third front, the Arctic. We're talking here about climate change, which is creating trillion-dollar opportunities for these countries. That's because the volume of ice in the Arctic has dropped by 70% since the 1980s. Data indicates that the first completely ice-free day is expected to occur before 2030. And that is opening new trade routes that could revolutionize global commerce. The Northern Sea Route, which follows the Russian coast, is the most important. But there is also the Northwest Passage along the North American coast and the Transpolar Route, which passes through the North Pole. Any of these routes can drastically shorten trips between Asia, Europe, and North America, moving billions of dollars. Russia wants to control these routes. Putin sees the Arctic as a golden opportunity to make up for the economic losses from sanctions. New fishing opportunities are also emerging, with species like Atlantic cod migrating to the Bering Sea and the Barents Sea as the waters warm. But here we come to a subject that has become a problem for Russia: Western sanctions. These sanctions are making it increasingly difficult for Russia to maintain the infrastructure it already has in the Arctic. And guess who is offering to help? Take a look at this concrete example. The Russian liquefied natural gas company Novatek has already been forced to replace an American company, Baker Hughes, with a Chinese company to help with a major project in the Arctic. China is not just helping, it's gradually taking control. Federal Security Service documents warn that the economic impact of the sanctions could make it more difficult for Russia to maintain its existing Arctic infrastructure. Who better than China to step in and improve that infrastructure? China can use its economic power to put Russia in debt through infrastructure development projects, gaining influence over emerging trade routes that Russia would prefer to control on its own. And here we come to the central point of this whole story. Putin has gotten himself into a trap he can't escape from. The Federal Security Service's own documents admit that losing China's support during the war in Ukraine would be worse than directly confronting what China is doing to weaken Russia from within. Think about the impossible situation Putin finds himself in. If he confronts China about the espionage, he loses the only major ally he has. If he does nothing, China keeps stealing Russian military secrets, preparing territorial claims, and taking control over strategic resources. Meanwhile, economically, China keeps profiting enormously from Russia's desperation. Yes, China buys Russian oil, but at prices far below the market rate. In 2023, China saved over $10 billion by buying Russian and Iranian oil at reduced prices, taking advantage of Western sanctions. In November 2024 alone, China was the largest buyer of Russian fossil fuels, accounting for 40% of sales and sending $5.71 billion to Putin. Now stop and analyze. China is paying less for these fuels than it would under normal market conditions. In other words, Russia is losing money by making China its biggest oil customer. China also sells strategic materials to Russia, such as germanium, antimony, and gallium, which are essential for building drones and missiles. At the same time, China banned the sale of these same materials to the United States in December 2024, claiming it was because of the military applications of these materials. But what about Russia? Is there no problem selling to them? Why? Because you're profiting from it? Meanwhile, several Chinese state-owned companies have already reduced their purchases of Russian oil due to the threat of Western secondary sanctions. This shows that the bond between Russia and China is more fragile than it seems, with money being enough to make China distance itself from Russia when convenient. The United States Council on Foreign Relations described China's approach to Russia very accurately. Chinese leaders see Russia as a transactional strategic opportunity, not an emotional connection. They also stated that China does not trust Russia on any deep level and is only dealing with it now because Putin's broader goals roughly align with China's goals. And that's very far from a partnership without limits, as they themselves say. In the end, China is systematically weakening Russia through economic exploitation, while strengthening itself militarily by stealing Russian secrets and laying the groundwork for future territorial claims. China is also developing a new strategy to gain soft power in Central Asia, starting with Uzbekistan, countries that were once under the Soviet sphere of influence and that Putin wants to reclaim. Well, my friends, this is the reality behind the limitless partnership between Putin and Xi Jinping. China has found a way to dominate Russia without firing a single shot. It is using Putin's war against himself, turning what should have been an alliance into a relationship of dependence where China is the predator and Russia is the prey. For the West, this should be both alarming and a lesson. Alarming because a China strengthened with Russian and Western military technology can become an even greater threat. A lesson because it shows how China operates, patiently, strategically, always thinking in the long term. The next time you see Putin and Xi smiling together for the cameras, remember this: behind those smiles there is a much more complex game being played. And in this game, do you think Putin is a player or just a piece? Leave your opinion in the comments. And if this video helped you understand more about the current geopolitical reality, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with friends who also need to understand what's really happening in the world. Thanks for watching. See you next time.